So, first of all, welcome to today's session. We're going to be focusing on how universities can harness the passion and dedication of their student activists who are campaigning to move towards a society that's free from sexual violence. And so I'm delighted to introduce our guests today, Kemi and Sarah. Sarah, would you like to kick us off with a quick intro to yourself?
Yes, I will kick us off. So I'm Sarah Bradley, she, her. I am the current CEO of the Montfort University Student Union, and I've been in that role for 6 months now. Essentially what a CEO of student union does is they take care of the charity. So they make sure that is functioning in a really good way and for the purposes of its charitable objects. I take care of the brilliant staff team, and I am a facilitator to our elected student leaders who are elected annually. I'm Welsh, which you can probably tell. I'm an I'm an INTJ. I'm a Gemini, and I have a son, Fred, who's very cute. Do you want me to go into more than that?
I think that's wonderful. That's a great intro. Thank you, Sarah. Kemi, do you want to have a go at introing yourself?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. I am Kemi Agunbiade, or for the purposes of the podcast and because my name is quite long, everyone calls me Kemi. My pronouns are she, her. I have just finished my term as Vice President for Women for the Oxford Student Union, which is where I know Sarah from. She didn't mention it, but she was our Deputy CEO when I started in this role that I just came out of. And I'm one of the elected student. I was one of the elected student leaders for the academic year of 2021 to 2022. And my role was predominantly focusing on women's issues, women's rights, and also focusing a lot on, because it predominantly impacts women, sexual violence, which is why I'm here. And before I did that, I did a lot of voluntary student activism. Which is also part of the reason I was here, because I was co-chair of It Happens Here from must have been 2020 to 2021, just before I went into the Vice President for Women role. And It Happens Here is also part of the Oxford Student Union, so I've been in the student union for a while, and have gotten to know a lot of people and been supported in a lot of different ways. And
that's great. It's a prime thing to have landed your intro on the It's Happened Here campaign, which is obviously the anti-sexual violence campaign that was run out of or associated with the Oxford SU. I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Kenny, if you wouldn't mind, sort of about the history of the campaign and its primary goals, if you wouldn't mind to begin.
I first encountered It Happens Here before it became a SU campaign. So SU campaigns are come under the Oxford SU banner, where there are 7, about to be 8 campaigns that cover different vulnerable groups. So that is survivors, LGBTQ, disabled students. They're about to get a suspended students campaign, students of color. Yeah. And I was on It Happens Here. Before I was part of the committee, before I was co-chair of the committee, I worked with them on a project before they had just become an SU campaign, which meant they get funding from the SU, and access to a lot of the university stakeholders by nature of being associated with the SU name. And I think it kind of became part of the SU in it must have been 2019, because I was very young then. And yeah, it's been a campaign for a few years now. But before that, they were still doing they were still doing a lot of work in Oxford, but much smaller. I think it's definitely built up a like membership base in the like a huge membership base in like around Oxford students.
And for those that aren't already familiar, can you just talk a little bit about like what exactly its goals are and what it exists to achieve?
Well, so it happens here. I would say it's split into two. It's one to promote the welfare of survivors, and then two to tackle the epidemic of sexual violence that's going on. So for people who have already unfortunately experienced like childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence and sexual assault in all of the different ways you can experience it, how to best support them with either with the welfare, so like whether or not that's focusing on improving the universities and local services in Oxford, but also how to improve like our disciplinary procedures, whether that is like the actual legal system, which is much harder to do when you're a student, or like within the university, which is generally the focus, and then also focusing on like preventative methods and talking about like consent and how do we establish these like healthy understandings of consent and healthy relationships, because there's also been like a huge shift towards like talking about like not just sex but also like relationships and domestic violence, and how we can fight against that as well. So bringing awareness to these issues and topics like coercion, and understanding that consent is more than no means no, yes means yes. Yeah, and that looks like yeah. So the Oxford SU, historically, at least for the last few years, because I've only been in Oxford since 2018, so I'm not as educated on pre 2018, pre 2017 even. And yeah, so I know a lot. So I know about the last few years, but the SU provides consent. Let me get this right. Consent workshop facilitator training. So we provide content for consent workshops to be held within colleges, because Oxford, a big thing about Oxford, is that it's a collegiate system. So there is like a main university, but underneath that, like there is colleges, which are the like for a lot of students, maybe not all, depending on like if you're undergraduate, postgraduate, but colleges are like the was it the social, educational, and like welfare hubs for like a lot of students, and most students live in their college or are associated with the college, especially in undergraduate, less so in postgrad when you might be associated with the department. So we train students to be able to lead consent workshops, and consent-based discussions in their colleges. So we provide them with all of the resources and all of the scenarios and statistics, and talking about like, oh, these are these are the myths that are perpetuated in our society around like consent and sexual violence. Like, for example, like all perpetrators are men and all survivors of sexual violence are women, which is obviously not true, but like talking about those myths and being like, these are why they're wrong, these are the statistics, these are like people's actual experiences, and then talking through like scenarios of like, what do you think consent was established here, and having students actively participate and practice consent, because for me at least, it's definitely a skill that you build up, because sex education in many places, but including the UK, is not great, which means we don't teach people to communicate about sex, and like it means that people don't communicate about consent, which means they can become these like blurry lines of like, oh well, like I asked you 17 times and you said yes in the last time, so does that count? And like how we talk about it. Yeah.
Powerful thing to think about, the element of like communication around this topic, both when we're communicating to students, but also helping students to communicate about this. I wonder if you could briefly, maybe, Kemi, touch on the meaningful change that you've seen come about as a result of this, from your own, what you've witnessed, or from stats that you know of.
In terms of stats, I don't have any off by hand, but in terms of meaningful change that I've seen over the past few years, and that I've been lucky enough to be a part of, working with the university on like policy work. So not even like policies that impact students. So, for example, one big thing, both while I was on It Happens Here and also while I was Vice President for Women, was working on a staff-student relationship policy, and making it clear that students want this, so that there are clear lines, of there's like clear lines of power distinction. So, when a tutor has responsibility over a student, so when a tutor can like marks your essays and is responsible for your like educational progress, you should not be able to enter into a romantic or sexual relationship with them, because there is a power dynamic that means that you're more likely to do this. And so like getting to participate in conversations about like what that looks like and pushing for that, especially like I got into It Happens Here basically during the pandemic. So there was a lot less student facing things than we would like, but we got to make a lot of like meaningful change around the policy, and also in terms of like awareness. One of my favorite things that I actually did just before I ran for Vice President for Women, while I was on It Happens Here, was an intersectionality panel. So talking about like the barriers for different types of survivors, whether that is people of color, LGBTQ survivors, or like male survivors, and talking about like how we can we already need to bring more awareness to people impacted by sexual violence, but like these are the reasons why all of these other different people are not coming forward. And we have to dismantle our idea of who survivors are, because they're not all like white cis straight women. So that's definitely been really great. And also just providing like a sense of students feeling like they, one, deserve to be listened to, but two, feel like heard by the SU, which I hope they have felt while I've been
really,
in these
really
roles.
interesting and so powerful. And of course, so much of this is about engaging the student population. So I guess, Sarah, I'd love to hear a little bit about what shape does that take at De Montfort and the impact there.
So De Montfort is a very different university to Oxford, for lots of reasons that we won't go into, but one of them being that it's not collegiate. So in terms of engagement, there is, I guess, less of a barrier there. De Montfort run a quite a large-scale mandala project, which seeks to offer a safe space for survivors of sexual violence, harassment, and domestic abuse. And they also run bystander and consent training for some committee members of their sports clubs. It's interesting. DSU's interaction with that is definitely growing, and for sure something that we're spearheading quite a bit as a student union. We are currently undergoing an EDI audit, for example, which will kind of take a look at all of our policies, processes, and procedures, including how we collaborate with the university and where we can do better as two institutions. But there's definitely a longer way to go. But I would probably say that of every institution, of every university, and I'm sure every university would agree. Yeah.
Absolutely. When you say do better or a longer way to go, can you think of some of the sort of opportunities that there are for the SU to sort of build its relationships with students through the SU?
It's an interesting one. So when I speak of a longer way to go, I actually touch on a bit of what Kemi has just spoken about this kind of the systemicness of consent, the systemicness of sexual harassment and sexual violence. It's interesting. So the vast majority of the students at De Montfort, for example, are home students. So we kind of have an idea of, and by home students, those are students who are based in the UK. So we kind of have an idea of what their education might have been like in the education systems that sit around sexual education at the bare bones basics level. And I think we have known for decades that is well below par for the vast majority of how, I mean, think back to our sex ed classes in school. I don't think consent was even mentioned. And like Kemi said, discussion, narrative, relationships, it was certainly not something that we were taught. So there's this kind of so then you go to university, and if it's a campus-based university, you're literally living there, and you create this community within that campus-based university that already has systemic gaps when it comes to knowledge of sexual violence, sexual harassment. And I think, I can't remember the SU, and I'm going to kick myself for this because they were brilliant. They did a piece of research locally on knowledge of what sexual violence actually is, and how that correlates to the amount that it's recorded. And I would say that that's probably true in most universities. How can you say this is sexual violence and harassment if you don't know that it is? So when I say we have a way to go, I'm talking more at a very systemic level. And I think the role that universities and student unions can play in that is outreach to schools and more collaborative education between further education and higher education. And of course, then we move into the realms of, is higher education a social good, or is higher education a commodity? Now, and I won't go into that because it's not quite what we're going into, but institutions like De Montfort, for example, are very integrated in their community. They are very integrated in their local schools and colleges. So we already have an in. And I think that there is more to be done at that level before they enter university, or even just admitting that we have young adults entering university with minimal sex education and fixing the problem.
And of course, a lot of the pushes on sort of education, whether it's before uni or at uni, but in your experience, how have students responded to this sort of push around education on consent and sexual violence?
I think it goes with anything. I think if you kind of say to students, right, you have this one more thing to learn, you have this one more thing to do, there's this definite feeling of, why does it matter to me? And I would say that's not just a student thing either. I think that if you were to start doing mandatory training for staff, they would probably feel the same. But students at De Montfort, sports clubs especially, have done a lot of work in kind of reversing that culture. And I know, and I've only been there 6 months, so I can't speak for it, but I know that they've done a lot of work in that. So that kind of cultural shift is definitely happening, which is really gratifying to see. And the university have certainly done a wonderful job at sort of targeting where potentially the majority of those problems will stem from, and sort of offering that training. But again, it's kind of this holistic. If you just tack on consent and bystander training, but you can't see why, and you can't see sort of the benefit of that, and you're also not tacking on to this idea that you are part of a community now, and you do have a responsibility to your peers and your colleagues, that is probably where it's going to be more ineffective. Not saying that it's ineffective, but slightly less effective, put it that way. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And Kemi, I'd ask you the same question around what you've noticed about sort of students' response to this push around the educative piece.
I think that's really interesting because I think being in the roles I've been in, it can feel like a bit of an echo chamber because like in my committee, obviously it would be like, oh yeah, of course we want this. Of course we all want the same thing. But like in terms of training, there are a lot of people who think like, oh, this is obvious, because a lot of the time, like, especially people where the lines of consent are blurry, where you don't, like, with, again, coercion being one of the main examples, you don't think that you are part of the problem. So until someone is like, oh, what you're doing right now is coercion, and someone tells you that, and you're like, oh, that's I don't see myself as one of the like perpetrators of this. And it definitely in terms of like engaging women, at least in my time, it was much easier. Like I think one of the things about It Happens Here is that like most of our team are like women or non-binary people. I think now they have like a few men in different roles, which is good. And there is like a designated men's rep because of the fact that like we want more engagement with men in these discussions, because I genuinely think there's a lot of people who care about it. But there's a lot of people who also are like, I don't think I have more to learn. Also, one of the big issues we had is like attendance by postgraduates. So like people who are mostly not like 18, 19-year-olds, however like old you are when most undergraduates go to uni, who like people of varying ages, some of whom are married. Like I think Oxford SU has done like some like put in quite a bit of effort of like trying to engage with graduates, and like trying to accommodate, like, we know that your experience of this is going to be much different, because again, some of you are like, a lot of you are in like long-term relationships. Like I have friends who are postgraduates now, and their experience of like consent is very different from like, oh, it's freshers week, like people have been drinking, all of that stuff. And trying to engage with like postgraduates, men, like certain groups, I think has been more difficult than others. I think postgraduates mainly because you're older, you kind of assume like, oh, I've navigated enough like sexual and romantic relationships, I have a good idea, which I kind of understand. But again, like, I think consent is something that we should all be practicing and learning about throughout our lives. So it's just good to have like a refresher. And like, what I think it's really interesting what Sarah said about a lot of DMU students being home students, because a large percentage of our like international students are postgraduate. So on top of it being important, because like whatever age you should be practicing, we also have to acknowledge that like we don't like we only just about know the scope of like consent, which is not really great, education for students in the UK. So we definitely don't know the like differences, even in terms of like how people communicate in different countries, and like how like non-verbal communication comes in on that. So I think, yeah, there are some people who are like, oh, I'm gonna walk in and I'm gonna do this because like it's for improving like the community. There's some people who will admit that like they don't really know that much and they want to know more. But obviously the workshops are especially supposed to benefit the people who probably don't think they need them as much, because like that's always where it hits, right? Like in the same way we have like people are talking about like anti-racism training, and it's like, oh, the people who would not attend it are probably some of the people who need to attend it the most. So I think that can always be an issue, which is why a lot of students want to make it mandatory to do the consent workshops in colleges. And some of them are, but some of them it's just like strongly recommended.
You're diving into such a deep sort of complex philosophical conversation once you start to mandate consent workshops.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something you want to touch on briefly. It's slightly off script. We could probably go on for days, weeks, and hours.
I think that in terms of mandating it, it's a very difficult topic, like you said, because at least at Oxford there's like an online course and then available, and then an in-person workshop. I think the issues with making the in-person workshop mandatory is that some people will be overwhelmed. And like when I was leading the training, I would be like, make sure people know that they can leave if they feel really overwhelmed, because talking about these issues can be really triggering for a lot of people. And I think, which is why a lot of people are like, oh, the online course that you can do in your own time is better to be mandatory. But yeah, I think
I'm sure it could be triggering even just having to opt out of that kind of workshop.
Yeah, and publicly opt out, and like even though you know you can, it's like but I think making them mandatory, at least some of the provisions, or just like reinforcing that you should attend because it's for like the greater community and stuff like that, and like the expectations, because I think there's a lot of people who also just go because of social pressure, because if you're the only one not going to the consent workshops, people are like, it's not going to look good. Yeah, I think it would be a good idea.
In sum, I think it would be a good idea. I like that. I really find it interesting, your point around sort of actually making the online element the mandated part, because one can do it in their own time and so on. That's quite an interesting take on it. Sarah, do you have any particular views, thoughts one way or the other on mandating this kind of training?
Probably similarly to Kemi, actually, it's not a simple yay or nay. I think there's definitely there are benefits of going to university if you're a certain kind of student, which is the social side, the sports side, that sort of element. And I think what we're seeing trends wise is that is that classic university student, you know, the one you always think, oh, well, then they did A levels and then they went to university and then they joined a sports club and then they graduated. Like that's, I think we are moving away from that, if I'm honest, potentially a lot faster than some universities want to admit. And potentially faster than the government wants to admit as well. But those students you can capture, those students you can get, right? Because there is a route to get what they want, which is, if you want to lead a sports team, this is how you do that responsibly. If you want to be a leader, part of being a leader is looking under the hood and seeing the mess in there and starting to unpick systemic biases and systemic beliefs, and that is how you become a really good leader, and that is what universities are putting out into the world. They're putting out future leaders, so that's part of that, right? But again, it kind of feeds back into my point about tacking these on as individual items. I don't think that works. I think if you were going to make anything mandatory, make personal development mandatory and turn it on its head what that means. And if the idea of higher education is to produce the next best nurse, produce the next best lawyer, produce the next best, like it's what does that mean?
Yeah.
What,
like, the rounded person.
Are we truly tapping? Yeah. So yeah, if you were going to make anything mandatory, it would be that non-tokenistic, non-tick box. Hey, I did racism training, I'm not a racist. That sort of thing. It would be this holistic overview.
Yeah. So obviously we've been touching on active bystander throughout this conversation as quite an essential part of the wider training around sexual violence. Kemi, I know that you, I think, have indeed yourself led active bystander training sessions in the past. So I'd love to hear a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, on sort of what you found really worked well in those.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just realizing how much training I did run in my role. I really enjoyed running the active bystander training. a lot of it was, and I definitely agree with what Sarah's saying, that we need like a whole like holistic view of like, oh, it needs to be integrated further, instead of like you do the training once. But I do think it's good for like introducing students to these different methods of intervening with like harassment in respectful ways, because it all stems from like the bystander effect, which some students do know when they come into the session, some students don't. And the bystander effect being like, we think that when we're walking down the street and someone needs help, that the next person who's walking down the street will step in and help, because we're like, I've got so many things going on, I can't do this right now, or I'm not equipped to handle this. The next person will be, but the next person is thinking the exact same thing. And like, I've seen situations like this, both with like people I know and people I don't know. And definitely I've participated in this because we all have. But it's just showing students that there are different ways, including ways that like don't put you in any harm, where it's as simple as like going to someone within your college, or going to the manager in a bar and being like, this is a terrible thing that's going on and something needs to be done about it. Because when we don't say anything, it just like a lot, like there's so many people who get away with things because they think it's acceptable because no one ever calls them out on it. And I think what like it kind of links to what Sarah was saying about personal development, which is like giving students a voice in whatever way they can express that voice, whether or not that is like supporting people who have been affected by harassment afterwards, or whether that is being like someone who is confident enough to be like, oh, this person is doing this, or someone who is confident enough to walk up to someone who is bullying someone because of like many reasons, be that like misogyny, racism, Islamophobia, all of those reasons. And also like what we talked about on awareness, like showing different students what different experiences of harassment look like, because like at Oxford, obviously saying this as a woman of color who went to Oxford for years, a large percentage of Oxford students are still white, are still coming from really privileged backgrounds, so they don't know what harassment looks like for other marginalized groups. So like loads of cis people don't know what transphobic harassment looks like. And that be as simple as saying like, oh, you don't belong in women's spaces because you are not a woman in the way I'm a woman. And like making sure that people are clear, like these are the different ways, which I think is quite powerful. Yeah.
Really interesting. And I know we touched on this slightly earlier about how often it can be the people for whom workshops might be most relevant, but they may not be the ones who are actually joining. What did you find uptake to be like when you were running these active bystander training sessions?
Yeah, I thought it varied because so the initial reason why I started doing them was after an increase in spiking incidents across the UK. So I'm not sure if you saw like the Girls' Night In protest, like everyone, like basically coming out of the pandemic, we saw like a lot of people experience spiking, obviously like predominantly women. And a lot of people wanted to be like hyper vigilant about it, which is a great thing about like students in general, but especially Oxford students. And I've seen like a range of different people, some of whom are in like roles in their colleges and their sports teams and their like ball committees and whatever. But some of whom are just students who want to learn more, which is great. So and like a range of different people from different genders, which is the great thing about like the training, but also like I said, like I exist in this microcosm of most students, like most students I've interacted with are the ones who are active enough to come to me in my position. So I can't say that like all of the different people are represented. I've definitely heard from like sports teams who have wanted the training, like different colleges, different even like there's been like postgraduates who have wanted it, undergraduate, but I don't think I can say like, oh, the uptake is much better than it was in previous years. because I think it's still like, oh, it's still a small like amount of students. And some of them might have been trained by my predecessor because like if they felt like, oh, I've been trained enough by this person, maybe I won't uptake it, which I think like training is something you should try and do like frequently to still maintain like these skills and stuff. But yeah, I think I can't like that's the issue because I lead the training. I can't say if the people who need to be there the most are there, because those are probably the people who might even partake in the harassing or like still might be like, oh, I'm not part of the problem because like it's the person who's doing the harassing who's the bad one, not me if I don't help. And like not saying anyone is bad for not helping because there's so many barriers, but like it's some people are just not aware that they can do even like us like there's a range of things and even the smallest thing can make a difference, like even checking on someone after they've been harassed like can make the world of difference to them feeling supported.
And from your whole experience of running these training sessions, I wonder if there's particular things that you wish you could do sort of going forward.
In terms of changing the training or like in terms of just structural, like?
I think a little bit of both. Whatever comes straight to mind.
I think it would be great, again, like, it would be great if we could integrate times for students to, again, keep practicing these things. And for, like, I make sure whenever I'm doing training to have students like give me questions and ask me whatever questions they want. But I do think in terms of the consent training, we work a lot with the university, which is great. I think in terms of the bystander training, I think we could do more around that and like integrate more of like the harassment, the like advice, like unit, like all of these different people who could work with us more to kind of also integrate that and like provide us with more resources, because obviously like I'm aware of the resources I'm aware of. In terms of structurally, I think it's one of those things where it's difficult because like I think Sarah was right earlier, where you like higher education should be interacting more with further education, because like by the time we're getting these students, there's at least in most cases like 18 years where we can't account for what they've learned. So it's really hard to undo and unpick that. So it would need to be more like the education system in the UK needs to improve as a whole, because people shouldn't be learning about sexual consent when they're 18 and probably about to and might be about to sleep with someone for the first time. People should be learning about it building on that knowledge, like in the way we build on like our math skills. Like you learn addition in 1 year and then you learn algebra, like in the same way that you need to learn like yes means yes, no means no, and then you learn about like, oh, it's more complicated than this as you get older. So I think I think the whole country and the government and also like society, because people should be comfortable enough to have these conversations with their kids, but like a lot of people are not in that position where their parents have had those conversations with them.
Sarah, I see you nodding along there. Was there something you wanted to add there?
Just nodding ardently. Kemi and I, this is Kemi and I, like we talk and we're like, yes. No, it's interesting. So I have a son in primary school at the moment, and they are definitely integrating this relationship from a very young age, and then they progress it up to sex education. So it's progressive and iterative, and that's a really good step in the right direction. I suppose the challenge is that's quite isolated into that academy trust, and it has to go through an inordinate amount of opinion before it kind of gets to the kids. And some of those opinions are, like Kemi said, they're systemic. And you could imagine the conservative nature of some families versus the more liberal nature of some families quite literally coming to a head in 6 and 7 year olds. But so yeah, like we're not going to fix that overnight for sure, but I think there needs to be a definite recognition by higher education institutions that is what they are dealing with. They are actively and wanting to build a community of students, which is brilliant. And as such, that community has deeply ingrained flaws that they can start to work with further education on to kind of alleviate some of the burden as the resource burden of having to deal with those flaws coming out quite violently in some places. Sure, they can do that, but they can also kind of admit that that is what we're dealing with. There's, and I know I'm going off on a tangent, sorry,
no, please,
but there's this there's a strange expectation I have found of students coming in. Let's say they are the 18 archetypal student, which doesn't exist anymore, but say they are 18. There's this expectation of, well, they're adults now. And with that expectation comes this weight of, oh, well, then they already have a strong understanding of self-worth, self-esteem, self-advocacy. And the people saying that don't have that understanding. I'm 34 and that's still my journey. I have, we speak to grown men in their 60s. They have no idea of their own self-worth. So it's really interesting that we kind of push this on 18-year-olds as if they do, as if they wake up one day on their 18th birthday and they have a sudden innate understanding of who they are and how they want to show up in the world. Which is so unfair. And we do, and the adults do it to each other. When in actual fact, we probably all do it. We probably wake up every day and we go, oh, like, because we're still learning, because the journey is iterative, because the journey is organic. So when we talk about community building, and I'm such a fan of organizational behavior, Kemi will know this. Organization. When we talk about community building, let's look at it in an organizational behavior mindset. Let's look at what is a community, what is a culture, and like let's take a big step back and see it that way. And bystander intervention training touches so many more things than sexual harassment, sexual violence, and domestic abuse. It touches bullying, like day-to-day politeness. It touches on sort of things that we would say, like not littering. Like bystander intervention training touches on all of these elements, which in ways is brilliant, but we've kind of applied it to this tiny thing, which is sexual harassment, which isn't a tiny thing, but you know what I mean? In the broad spectrum of being a decent human being in the community that we're building. Yeah, sorry, that was a tangent.
No, I think it's actually not a tangent. It's actually getting right to the crux of it, community building, and every element of what it is to live and exist in a good, harmonious community is actually being an active bystander is quite fundamental to all of that. So I'm glad you brought that up. Kemi, did you want to add anything there?
I mean, first of all, now it reminds me why I miss working with Sarah, but she left. No, but no, I think you're completely right, because also I think it's like schools don't know how to talk to students about one, how to exist in a community, or they're only just learning or like starting to learn now, and that also includes like schools not knowing how to talk about sexual consent, but a lot of parents also don't know. So if maybe there was, for example, like resources on how to talk to your kids, because a lot of sorry to bring it back to the like consent training, a lot of students, when we like were reviewing like, oh, how should we change this? How should we do this? We're saying like, I just need even like an example of how to bring this conversation up that doesn't make it seem awkward. And I'm like, like this is like having the conversation in the first place should be something like practiced ages ago. I don't know, like it's the fact that like like schools have not been prepared for this, and we have this like fountain of knowledge. We have all of these, we have like so many great like charities, organizations, that like even this past year, like I've worked with on like sexual consent, like sexual health in general, who are these like up and coming, like quite young people. But I think it is still like obviously schools and like parents are like like have these generational gaps between like the people who are like, oh yeah, let's talk about this, and let's like empower people to even tell people to stop learning. Because for me, bystander training does cover like a lot of topics. Like it's kind of it's not, I don't want to call it sneaky, but it's kind of like a lot of people are like, oh, we want to focus on this to deal with like night safety and like spiking and sexual violence, but also like a large chunk of it is how to be an ally to marginalized people. And I'm like, I love to be able to like fit that in, because it's like, you're not expecting me to talk about like racial harassment, but like we're going to talk about it, or like it's like anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, all of these, and how they one interlink, but also how they're systemic, and how you can listen to those marginalized groups and you can do all of these things. Like there's so much more to there's so much more that like if you focus on like listening to how people and like vulnerable people need to be supported, and that includes like survivors of sexual violence or people who are more likely to be like vulnerable to like sexual abuse and sexual violence. If you learn how to listen to and be an ally to those groups, then also like consent comes easier, because you're like, oh, I'm active, like I'm not going to assume what people want. I'm going to work with them to establish a way of communicating and figuring out what they want and what they need. Yeah.
No, it's so interesting. And I suppose also all of this, part of all of this is remembering that, you know, there's so much out there research around how students with the greatest sense of belonging do the best. And, you know, active bystander really underpins this idea of community, and community is fundamental to that sense of belonging. So ultimately it's all sort of linking up as so fundamental all to each other. I'm kind of spitballing there. I wonder if we could spend a moment just thinking about some of the reasons that actually students can still be hard to engage on these topics, and what you both think about that. Sarah, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I think there's a practical element and then there's a social element. So the practical element is a student comes to university and they get information overwhelm. So pre induction, they get all of this pack, and it's like, hello, you're coming to university, this is how you live, this is how you eat, this is how you learn. You know, so they're doing all of that. It's a huge transitional phase, and as we know, every time we go through a huge transitional phase, our brains only have so much capacity for information. So there's that. And I think that there is, during induction, universities want to get it all in that first few weeks, get it all out the way. Hey, coming to university is and then also bystander training, anti-racism training, all of this. And it's just information overwhelm and overload. So if I were in that position and there was online elements that weren't mandatory, I would probably say, oh, I'll get to them when I've got the mental capacity to do so. And then I probably wouldn't. So there's that element. And then there's this social element that I think we've already touched on, which is, I don't understand why I need this. Like Kemi said, why am I doing this? And I think that's why they can be quite hard to engage. And also delivery. If you're going to go to a lecture theatre and talk about consent, it's going to take you back to those really awkward sex education classroom, year 9, where you watch that awful video of that family walking around naked, like, you know, it was, or whatever. I feel like everyone who went to a Catholic school is nodding with me right now and going, oh yeah, I remember that video. It was so weird. But like, so yeah, you've got this association, haven't you, in terms of delivery, and we haven't quite, as an education institution, we haven't quite cracked the delivery of what good training is. Ironically, so yeah.
Kemi, same question to you.
I'm sorry.
Just giggling at the thought of it all there.
Just to focus on the video first. I don't know if it's because I didn't go to a Catholic school or like the age gap that exists between me and Sarah. I don't know. Anyway, we had the tea videos, and I definitely agree with you in that like some people like the if you don't want tea, then you can say no, and you shouldn't have tea. It's but in terms of, I think there's a difference between like, in terms of engaging with students as a whole, because that's what I took this question to mean, and engaging with students specifically around like the like consent workshop training. I think in terms of the consent active bystander stuff, I think Sarah's right, where like a lot of the time you have to admit that there's a gap in your knowledge for you to do it, either that or like a ton of social pressure, which again, sometimes I think is like quite useful. At least when I came in when I was a fresher in 2018, a lot of people in my year at my college did the consent workshops because like everyone was doing them, and whether or not you felt like they were super engaging, whether or not you felt like you were hearing anything new, I think I'm a person who's like, oh, I'm always ready to learn. I can't assume that I know everything, but like not everyone is like that. So I think it's about like really trying to, I think it's also about like really trying to work with students to figure out like, where have we gone wrong? What do we need to be talking about? Because there's some stuff that we should still be talking about. Like I came in and I was like, I mean, Sarah will remember this because you were there, but like, I was like, oh, we need to completely reform the consent workshop. We need to include coercion. We need to include this. We need to talk about like, one of the things I wanted to focus on was, what is it called? Like sharing, like intimate photos sharing and sexting and all of those things that, like people who are like 18 plus people who are under 18, but like loads of young people are doing. And it's like, we should cover that because loads of people don't know the law around that. Loads of people don't know like what consent looks like with that, and that's still like in a way sexual acts. Like we should be including stuff that's like working with students to hear like what they feel like they need, what they feel like they don't know, because then they're like, oh, at least I'm coming out of this like all of these things I've heard before, and then also all of these things some of these things that are completely new to me, which I appreciate. In terms of like engaging with students as a whole, I think that maybe this is me, again, recently being a student, I don't think students are really hard to engage with. I think they have like so many good ideas, and I think it's about figuring out where to platform them. And that's why I really liked working in an SU, and I imagine that's why Sarah like stayed in SU. Because I remember the person who did my role before me, and like the two people who did my role before me, a lot of what they did as vice president for women was like helping me develop my ideas, and like that's what I really enjoyed about doing my role. So I think it's like listening to students and centering students and being like what do you want, what do you think is possible, and then like using the resources and the knowledge I have, like knowing like the ins and outs and structures of universities and like who to talk to and how to make this happen, and like problem solving. That's how we make change. So always like centering like the ideas of students and not making them feel like their ideas aren't important or valid. Like just because I'm an elected officer doesn't mean that my ideas are the only ones that matter, and making sure that's reinforced, that they should give us ideas and they should give us their opinions. Yeah.
A two-way conversation. Really, really interesting comment. Thank you so much. I'm super mindful of time now, so if you've both got 1 more minute, I'd love to hear in 30 seconds, Sarah, one thing that you wished you'd known at the beginning of your sort of SU journey.
One thing I wish I'd known at the beginning of my SU journey.
Well, one thing before you'd started working with the Students' Union, or before your role now.
Okay, one thing I wish I...
for other people beginning roles in SUs.
I think one thing I wish I'd known is that I don't know anything, and that's it's okay. There is a humility that SUs give you, especially working with Oxford SABs, because they are taught to debate. No, but
never debated. I just want to can I go the record? And that it makes it sound like Sarah's trying to start an argument with me. We never debated. We agreed.
I'm not. No, I think if there, one piece of it, you don't know anything, and that is okay. Your journey is meant to be to learn, and you will learn, and you will learn from students, because that feedback is raw and it's brilliant.
Yeah, that's amazing advice. Be ready to learn, basically. Kemi, what about you?
Yeah.
I definitely agree with Sarah that you need to be ready to learn. I think be flexible. When I started in my role as vice president for women, I had a little break, but I'd come off of being co-chair of It Happens Here, so I was like, oh, this is how you do things. But I kind of realized that you have to be in order to be a problem solver, you also have to understand that you are going to be faced with different barriers, and you're going to have to figure out in the spot how to respond to them, or you're going to all of the for example, all of the increase in spiking incidents. We were not prepared for that. When that was put on my plate, I mean, Sarah again can attest to this. I was like, oh, what am I going to do? Because I came in thinking I'd do my projects and get out, but it's oh no, I needed to find out how am I going to represent students in this point. And agree with Sarah where it's being humble and knowing that your ideas are just a small part of the SU system. A lot of it is supporting the students and uplifting them. And it's so amazing to see so many people grow with while you were helping them. And one big thing for me was at least since it was an SU campaign, I was the first co-chair of color for It Happens Here, and now there are 2 co-chairs of color at the same time, which is such a big deal to leave behind and see them develop and make their own changes, because what I thought was important in my year is not what they think is important, and realizing that you're building a foundation for other people to develop their ideas and leaving behind a legacy for someone to build up.
Well, what a wonderful note to end on. Kemi, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fabulous speaking to you and a really interesting conversation. So thank you.